China has criticized the United States for hosting its Summit for Democracy and accused Washington of trying to undermine the international system in order to uphold its own hegemony. Beijing says Washington is inciting division and confrontation in the name of democracy and called it the biggest threat to global democracy.
Certain Western countries willfully and condescendingly criticize other countries' human rights conditions while turning a blind eye to their own systematic racism and racial discrimination in the past and at present. Still worse, they use human rights protection as the pretext for bullying, sanctions and belligerence, which is a typical double standard and a travesty of international human rights. We urge certain countries to discard their old habits, earnestly reflect on their deplorable track record of human rights, and face up and address their own problems.
The fact that the US felt this summit for democracy needed to be held at all suggests the nervousness in Western and other capitals about the state of their political systems. US President Joe Biden closed the virtual event, in which over 100 world leaders participated, with a rallying cry.
And as we close out the first gathering, let's together reaffirm our determination that the future will belong to those who embrace human dignity, not those who trample it, who unleash the potential of their people, not those who stifle it, and who give their people the ability to breathe free, not those who seek to suffocate their people with an iron hand.
The US used the summit to commit hundreds of millions of dollars to promote free, fair and transparent elections and other measures too. Critics say the money would be best spent at home, where significant numbers of Americans still believe the 2020 election was stolen and states redraw their election maps and pass laws that tend to disenfranchise many minority groups. There was also controversy over who was invited. Some democracies, like Hungary, Turkey, were not. The US hopes that this summit will be held in person by world leaders next year and hopes to use the framework to revive faith in the Western democratic model. Meanwhile, the investigation into the January 6th insurrection continues here and continues to reveal a deep distrust of the US political system from its own citizens. Nathan King, CGTN, at the White House.
A recent survey shows over half of young Americans believe that their country's democracy is in trouble or failing. This was conducted by the Institute of Politics at Harvard Kennedy School and based on a national poll of more than 2,000 Americans aged 18 to 29. The survey also suggests only 7% of young Americans describe the nation as a healthy democracy. They also believe there's a 35% chance of a second civil war in their lifetime and a 25% chance that at least one state will secede. Now for some insights, we have current affairs commentator Einar Tangen joining us in the studio and via video link, Professor Wang Xinsong from the School of Social Development and Public Policy at Beijing Normal University. Thanks so much for joining us, gentlemen. Now, Einar, I'd like to start with you. So China's foreign ministry released this report that points to some deficiencies and abuse of democracy in the US, for example, vetocracy, so saying no, a money-dominated politics, and that's manifesting in problems like gun violence, systemic racism, widening health gap. What do you think of this? Is US democracy in trouble?
Well, obviously it is. I mean, when you have an attack on your capital, when there's supposed to be a change of government, I don't know how else you can put it. The divisions, both socially and politically, are playing out on a daily basis. I mean, the number one thing that a government is supposed to do is ensure that you are safe in the streets, in your home, in your work, in your schools. Yet we see day after day, mobs of angry people looting, literally going into major cities and looting them en masse. It is a complete failure. You cannot have a system which you say to others is wonderful when it doesn't deliver.
Professor Wang, the same report also says that the US has tried to export its brand of democracy to other countries, and that's seen disastrous consequences. For example, military intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. Why hasn't America's democracy promotion worked, and can it work?
Well, it has always been an American foreign policy to promote democracy abroad. And this is not so much because the Americans believe that democracy is a good thing for these countries, as because the Americans think that this is good to the American political and security interests overseas. And that's why when, democracy is in its own way, the Americans do not hesitate to install dictators in other countries, especially during the Cold War. I mean, President Roosevelt in 1939 famously said, about a so-called autocratic leader that he may be an SOB, but he is our SOB. So this is always a maxim in American foreign policy. But the problem is that by imposing its own version of democracy overseas, it always creates disasters because democracy has to be reconciled with the local conditions, which is not always the case. That's why we see failures in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other countries where the Americans are trying to impose democracy.
And Einar, your thoughts on this? Anything to add on America's promotion of its democracy?
Bullets and bombs do not win hearts and minds. Change comes from within a country. It cannot be imposed by others, especially when it's very, very different cultures, systems, and people.
All right, well, I'd like to talk to you both about China's system in a moment, but let's look in a bit more detail at this. Well, China issued a white paper on what the Communist Party calls whole process people's democracy. Now, this document says Chinese people enjoy extensive and tangible democratic freedoms. Our reporter Huang Yue looks at whether these freedoms are in fact represented in people's day-to-day lives.
This is a contact station set up in the residential compound in Beijing's Shijingshan district, where residents can submit their opinions on China's draft laws and regulations. They can also give suggestions about issues concerning their daily life to staff members here, and one of the staff members is a lawmaker.
The participation of our citizens plays a massive role in the implementation of new regulations, and this whole process should be open and transparent. Contact stations play such a decisive role in collecting people's feedback and suggestions. This is how whole process democracy can be seen in a grassroots level.
If you ask ordinary people about their understanding of the whole process people's democracy, they don't use big words, but they say the concept is reflected in all aspects of their daily life.
I often see posts on social media that seek public opinion on some laws and regulations, such as the anti-food waste law and the garbage recycling regulation. You click a link and then give your opinion on how to make things better. This is really easy.
I used to think democracy wasn't something I had in my life, but recently my neighborhood committee has been asking for suggestions on a reconstruction plan for the residential compound where I live. We are currently discussing whether or not to install elevators.
Well, the concept of democracy was first introduced in China in the early 20th century, and China says it is exploring its own systems for democracy. Professor Wang, how far do you think China has come?
Well, I think finding a suitable democratic system takes a long time, and it took Americans 200 years to find a democratic system that basically works with its own society, although it's having trouble now. It takes the same, kind of process for the Chinese. We started as a socialist country with a very heavy influence from the historical heritages of Confucianism and all these political theories. So the Chinese society, the Chinese people stress the importance of results, outcomes, substance, because at the end of the day, whether you can deliver what people want really matters. And that's why our system emphasizes on the whole process democracy, because elections itself cannot, solely guarantee the outcome. It takes more stages to guarantee that. And I really suggest people look at the first white paper on Chinese democracy issued in 2005. If you make a comparison between that white paper and the most recent one, you see a lot of progresses in the institutional changes. And finally, let me quote Samuel Huntington, who said the most important political distinction among countries is not the form of government, but the degree of government. And quote, and let me just say, at the end of the day, what it takes is to satisfy people's demands.